The pilots of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing had a saying, "Afghanistan doesn't just hide the enemy, it hides their intentions." By late 2008, the war had shifted into a brutal chess match above the mountains. Every ridge line, every canyon, every shadow bowl of earth seemed capable of spitting fire at a moment's notice. The Taliban may not have had an air force, radar network, or surface-to-air missile batteries in the conventional sense, but they had something nearly as dangerous: local mastery of terrain and a growing library of observational tricks that allowed them to predict and sometimes preempt American air support. It was in the rugged expanse of Kunar Province, a place where mountains rose like serrated knife blades, that U.S. pilots first realized the Taliban were beginning to adapt. The insurgents had learned to track predictable air paths, analyzing how American aircraft entered valleys and approached firefights. They marked typical ingress points, studied likely turns based on aircraft type, and even passed radio messages through runners, the same way guerrilla groups had done for centuries. By early winter, the Taliban had started setting up ambush shooting lanes specifically designed for low-flying jets and ATENs responding to troops in contact. The enemy had no radar, but what they possessed, patience and topography, was sometimes enough. On the morning of November 13th, the crew of a pair of F-16C Fighting Falcons were preparing for what was supposed to be a routine closed air support patrol. Captain Ryan Kessler, call sign Viper 61, flipped to the laminated air corridor maps as the intel officer recited the latest threat brief. Taliban spotters have been tracking 10 runs near the Pesh River, the intel officer warned. They're calling out bearings based on engine echoes. They don't need radar. The valley walls do the work. Kessler leaned back in his chair. So they're using the terrain as a microphone? Exactly. They're trying to figure out your run-in angles by sound reflection. Kessler exchanged a look with his wingman, Lieutenant David Monroe, 6'2". If the Taliban understood their sound signatures, then coming in low and fast along the valley would be suicidal. That was when the ATO, the Air Tasking Order, included a strange addendum. Employ decoy formation Delta Echo. Kessler had heard about Delta Echo only once, during a briefing stateside. It was a deceptive formation developed after intelligence reports revealed that Taliban teams were timing their attacks based on the direction of the first audible jet approach. The concept was simple in theory, dangerous in practice. One aircraft flies a noisy, obvious approach path, while the actual strike aircraft comes in silently from an unexpected angle. 4 F-16s. That meant one jet flying a high-throttle decoy route above the valley's mouth, creating an acoustic signature that the Taliban would mistake for the real attack vector. Monroe looked at Kessler. "So I'm the bait?" Kessler smirked. "You're lighter on paperwork if things go wrong." By 0900, the two jets were pushing north, skimming above thin clouds as the Himalaya foothills came into view. Below them, the terrain resembled a patchwork of steel gray stone and steep, jagged folds, perfect for guerrilla fighters and terrible for aircraft that require maneuvering space. A JTAC Joint Terminal Attack Controller came over the radio from a pinned-down Army unit. Chaos 2-1 to Viper 6-1, taking fire from Northern Ridge, elevation 1,300 meters. RPGs. We've got no visibility on shooters. Kessler responded. Copy, Chaos. Viper flight is 2 mics out. Monroe peeled away, climbing slightly and pushing his engine harder to create the signature the Taliban spotters would expect. The roar of his F-16 echoed aggressively between the rock walls. Kessler, meanwhile, dropped altitude, slowly, carefully, throttling back to keep his presence nearly silent. He skirted the backside of the valley, following a tight ravine that barely had enough space for a turn. He felt the G-forces press against his chest as the mountains narrowed around him. The cockpit rattled. Snow-dusted stone blurred past his canopy. One wrong move, and he'd become a smear on the cliffside. Ground chatter, intercepted by a nearby Army signals team, confirmed what they hoped. The jet is coming from the east. Prepare the launcher. Wait until he makes the pass. Monroe kept up the decoy act, continuing his loud approach path. His aircraft boomed between the valleys, amplifying the illusion. Kessler whispered into the mic. 6-2. Keep them pointed your way. I'm in position. Monroe chuckled nervously. Roger that. Make it count. At that moment, the Taliban RPG team stepped into the open on a narrow ledge, preparing to fire into the assumed attack corridor. They were exposed for the first time. The JTAC spotted movement and marked the coordinates. Viper 6-1, target is hot, cleared to engage. A calculated strike. Kessler rolled the F-16 onto its side and descended sharply, diving into the hidden corridor behind the ridge. He felt the G-forces claw at him as the world tilted at 90 degrees. The terrain flashed by like a knife edge. He locked the GPS coordinates. Pickle, a single GBU, 38 JDM detached cleanly from his wing. The bomb carved down the mountainside, slipping between two stone outcrops before disappearing behind the ridge. Kessler pulled hard, climbing into a near-vertical ascent. From Monroe's perspective, the explosion erupted out of nowhere on the opposite side of where the Taliban had expected the attack. A radio relay, likely a Taliban observer, shouted in confusion. The bomb came from the west. There was no sound. The JTAC came back on comms, voice tight but relieved. Good effects, good effects. Ridge is quiet. No more RPG fire. The aftermath. As the jets regrouped, Monroe let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They really had no clue I was a decoy. Kessler banked into formation beside him. That's the point. Deception only works if you trust the enemy to think they're smarter than you. Later analysis confirmed the success. The Taliban had shifted their shooters into a kill box designed for Monroe's vector, completely missing the silent ingress path behind the ridge. For the first time, USAF intelligence realized something profound. Terrain, when understood correctly, wasn't just the Taliban's advantage. It could be turned against them. This mission became the blueprint for what would later be called acoustic misdirection formations, the basis for several other decoy operations across the eastern provinces. Why this episode matters. The strike in Kunar marked the first documented case of U.S. tactical aircraft using sound deception in mountainous terrain during the War on Terror. In a conflict where insurgents relied almost entirely on visual and acoustic cues, it became clear that predictable flight paths where deadly jet noise could be weaponized deception could neutralize terrain advantage. A two-ship element could mimic an entire squadron. This was the beginning of a new mindset in air operations. Air superiority wasn't enough. Pilots needed psychological superiority. And it was only the first of 7 times American pilots would rewrite the rules of engagement above Afghanistan's unforgiving mountains. In the late stage of the Afghan surge, pilots of the U.S. Air Force learned a bitter truth. The most dangerous time to fly was not at night. It was at sundown. The Taliban had studied American routines for years. They knew that during dusk operations, shadows played tricks on pilots. Dust plumes concealed movement, and the last rays of light created blind spots on targeting pods. It was in this narrow window, a 20-minute curtain between day and night, that insurgents often staged coordinated attacks, hoping to exploit the limitations of fading visibility. But the Americans had a reply: Ghost Squadron. Ghost Squadron wasn't a formal designation. It was an internal nickname for an improvised tactic the 354th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron began using around Helmand Province in 2010. Phantom formations, decoy silhouettes made to trick Taliban spotters into believing a much larger strike package was incoming. It was innovation born from necessity, and like all innovations in wartime, it began with a failure, a mission gone wrong. On August 4th, an Army platoon operating near Sanjin had taken heavy fire. They called for air support, expecting the usual combination of F divided by a -18s and a 10s rotating in patrol orbits. But something unexpected happened. Taliban fighters opened fire before the jets appeared, almost as if they knew the direction of approach and approximate time of arrival. Intel analysts later realized the truth. Taliban observers had learned how to read the dust trails left by convoys near FOB Jackson. When support was called, they counted movement on the ground, compared it with previous patterns, and guessed correctly exactly when air cover would arrive and from which bearing. It was crude, but effective. American pilots needed a way to scramble that predictive chain. And so, Ghost Squadron was born. The briefing, We need to become someone we're not. Major Alyssa Hartwell, call sign Havoc 1, stood before her pilots with a stack of satellite images and a dry erase marker. She drew crossing lines representing mountain ridges and Taliban observation points. "They're timing us," she said. "They're watching dust plumes, convoy spacing, drone orbit handoffs, everything. They think they understand our rhythm." She capped the marker and looked around the room. So we changed the rhythm. Her plan was deceptively simple. At sundown, 3 aircraft would fly high and wide, creating a massive radar-like shadow on the mountains, a ghost signature, tricking insurgent spotters into believing a full strike group of 6 or even 8 jets was approaching. Meanwhile, a real 2-ship element would slide in low, silent, and from a completely different direction to strike. It was a psychological trick intended to overwhelm the Taliban's observational calculus. Spotters would report a large formation, commanders would spread their fighters thin, RPG teams would position themselves toward the apparent approach vector, all while the real threat came from behind. If Delta Echo was an acoustic decoy, Ghost Squadron was a visual mirage. On August 12th, the tactic was tested for the first time. 3F/A, 18 Hornets took off from Kandahar Airfield, climbing to medium altitude. As the sun dipped behind a jagged Hellman ridgeline, their shadows elongated across the desert floor, merging into a single distorted shape. On the ground, the silhouette looked massive, as though the sky was full of aircraft. Taliban lookouts radioed frantically. 8 aircraft incoming from the north. Prepare for strike. But there were only 3 jets, and none of them planned to engage. At the same time, 2 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, call signs Reaper 5-1 and Reaper 5-2, hugged the terrain, moving so low that their altimeters beeped warnings every few seconds. The pair flew from the southwest, weaving through a dry riverbed that provided natural cover. Reaper 5-1's pilot, Captain Marcus Delgado, kept his eyes glued to the terrain following radar. "Stay low," his wingman murmured over comms. "If they hear our engines bouncing off the ridges, this whole thing falls apart." Delgado took a breath, exhaled slowly. "Copy. No one breaks silence until we strike." Above them, the 3F divided by a -18S continued their broad, lazy arcs, a performance meant only for an enemy watching from faraway high ground. Spotters reported what they believed was a massive formation approaching from the north. Insurgent commanders redeployed their men to face that direction, moving RPG gunners and PKM teams into what they thought was a correct ambush lane. Their logic was simple. Big formation equals big strike equals protect the northern approach. The insurgents stretched themselves thin, repositioning fighters to meet the perceived threat. Meanwhile, the actual target, a fortified compound staging weapons for a planned nighttime assault, lay entirely exposed on its southwestern face. The repositioning created a fatal blind spot. The strike, ghosts don't knock. 20 minutes after sundown, the sky briefly shifted colors, orange bleeding into black. In that interval, visibility for ground fighters dropped sharply. It was exactly the moment Major Hartwell had envisioned. From just 300 feet above the desert floor, Captain Delgado throttled up his A-10, popping over a small berm. His thermal targeting pod immediately lit up with signatures. Men scrambling, weapons crates stacked against the wall, and what looked like the faint heat plume of a concealed mortar tube. Delgado whispered on comms. "Reaper 5-1 tally. Cleared hot." The TAC's voice returned through static. "Reaper flight. Targets confirmed. You're cleared hot." Delgado fired a burst from the A-10's GU, 8/a 30mm cannon infamous for its bone-rattling growl. The sound rolled across the desert a fraction of a second before the rounds hit. The cannon fire shredded the compound southern wall, scattering fighters into the open, exactly what the low invisibility, low-light conditions were designed to exploit. Reaper 5-2 followed with a pair of Maverick missiles, striking the weapons cache and igniting a chain of secondary explosions. Above them, the F divided by a -18S continued to orbit, never touching their weapons, maintaining the illusion of a much larger force holding the enemy's attention. Ground intercepts captured the panic. Where did they come from? The jets were north. Why are they attacking from the west? We counted 8. were the other aircraft. Ghost Squadron had worked. The deception wasn't just strategic. It was psychological. The Taliban fighters froze, unable to reconcile what they thought they saw with what was happening. Aftermath in the dark. When the smoke settled, the JTAC's voice came over comms again, calmer now. Reaper flight, good effects. Compound secure. No further movement. Delgado exhaled, leaning back as the adrenaline drained from his body. His wingman chuckled, voice trembling slightly. Ghost Squadron. Damn, that actually worked. Up above, Major Hartwell's Hornets turned south, heading home. None of them had fired a shot. Their role was presence, illusion, misdirection. When the pilots later reviewed helmet cam footage and ground intercepts, something stood out. The Taliban commanders weren't just confused, they were scared. They believed they had misread American patterns so completely that any future prediction could be wrong. Fear, Hartwell noted in her report, was a force multiplier. If the enemy can't trust their eyes, they can't plan. If they can't plan, they can't win. Why this episode matters. The Sundown Ghost Squadron operation became one of the most studied deception tactics of the Afghan war. It revealed several truths. The Taliban relied heavily on visual observation, not sophisticated sensors. Shadows, altitude, and timing could be manipulated to create false signatures that a small group of aircraft could mimic an entire strike package. Psychological disruption was as valuable as kinetic action. The enemy's confidence, not just their positions, was a legitimate target. The U.S. learned that in asymmetric warfare, controlling perception was sometimes more important than controlling the airspace itself. This was the second of 7 times American jets outmaneuvered the Taliban using decoys. Not through raw power, but through understanding how insurgents thought, observed, and reacted. And the war was far from over. The Korengal Valley had a reputation that made even veteran pilots uneasy. Soldiers on the ground called it the Valley of Death. Pilots call it something else, something colder, the Valley that learns. Because every time American forces execute a mission in that narrow corridor of jagged stone and pine-covered ridges, the Taliban adapted. They changed positions, altered firing lanes, and adjusted ambush patterns with unnerving speed, as if the terrain itself were whispering lessons to them. By 2011, intelligence analysts noticed a disturbing trend. Insurgents in Korengal were beginning to anticipate U.S. air patterns with nearly surgical accuracy. They predicted where aircraft would enter the valley, which ridge they would hug, and which notch they would climb out of. The enemy did not have radar, satellites, or early warning systems. What they had were generations of environmental memory and a network of spotters who communicated through mirrors, whistles, and runners. Far quieter and harder to intercept than radios. The Air Force needed a breakthrough, and it came from an unexpected source, a deception tactic inspired by desert mirages. On a windless morning at Bagram Airfield, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called his pilots into a cramped briefing room. The blinds were half closed, letting in only a sliver of light, enough to illuminate the map of Korengal pinned to the wall. The intel officer tapped a red circle on the northern pass. We've confirmed that Taliban fighters are predicting our ingress routes based on solar reflection and shadow patterns on the mountains. They're assuming we'll avoid this corridor here. Too narrow, too steep. He drew a line representing the typical U.S. flight path, a long, predictable loop around the eastern ridge. They've set an RPG ambush here, he said. They know our timings to within 90 seconds. That's unacceptable. The room fell quiet until Captain Morgan, call sign Falcon 41, raised her hand. Whether they saw aircraft where there are none, she asked. The intel officer frowned, unsure. Hayes gestured for her to continue. In the desert, she said, mirages make distant silhouettes look bigger, closer, or multiplied. Heat and angle distort perception. What if we create a false visual array in the sky, something the Taliban thinks is a 3-ship element heading into the pass, when it's actually reflections? The room stirred. You're talking about a reflective decoy run? Hayes asked. Not exactly, she replied. We're talking about controlled optical distortion. Metal, sun angle, flight altitude. If we play it right, we can make them think an entire formation is entering Korengal from the north. Meanwhile, we slip into the western cut. The intel officer scribbled notes rapidly. That could force them to reposition, he whispered, or trigger an ambush prematurely. Hayes nodded. All right, he said. We're making the sky lie. The tactic required precision. 2 F-15ES would fly a high-altitude arc at a very specific angle, where the afternoon sun would strike the metal fuselage and scatter horizontally across the opposite ridge. At certain moments, the glare would bloom into multiple flashes, appearing to human eye as 3 or even 4 aircraft. Below them, hugging the granite backbone of the valley, a single A-10 and an F-16 would fly silently, using terrain masking to conceal their approach. If the timing worked, the Taliban would assume a heavy formation was coming from the north and expose themselves for a counterattack. If the timing failed, the ambush would be waiting exactly where the real aircraft would emerge. There was no margin for error. At 1,630 hours, the aircraft roared off the runway. The sky over Kunar Province was a deep cobalt blue, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind the peaks. Flying at nearly 20,000 feet, the 2 F-15ES banked into a wide orbit. Below them, the world looked ancient. Ridges folded like the spines of sleeping beasts, narrow trails clinging to stone like scars, the valley floor swallowed in shadow. The lead pilot, Major Durant, adjusted his throttle and spoke through his mask. Falcon element, approaching reflection point. Stand by. On the ground, the Taliban spotters scanned the sky with cheap binoculars. They were waiting for the familiar silhouette of a single jet. Instead, they saw something stranger. 3 glints, then 4, pulsing in the sunlight like a cluster of moving stars. One of the spotters radioed urgently. Multiple jets. For aircraft approaching from the north. The second spotter confirmed. They are coming in tight formation. Prepare the launcher. Except no jets were coming from the north. The lights were nothing but sun bouncing off the F-15ES fuselages. The mirage was working. As the Taliban teams prepared for the northern approach, the real attack element, Captain Morgan in the A-10 and Lieutenant Shah in the F-16, slipped silently through the western ridge. The world around them narrowed to a corridor of stone and dying sunlight. Their altimeters chirped continuously as they skimmed dangerously close to the rock faces. Morgan checked her targeting pod. I've got heat signatures, she whispered. Lots of movement. They're out in the open. Shah exhaled. They took the bait. What they saw next was rare. A full insurgent firing line, RPG teams kneeling in the open, heavy machine gunners adjusting their aim toward the phantom formation. They were convinced the ambush would hit 4 jets at once. Morgan keyed the radio. Chaos 3-1, this is Falcon 4-1. Visual on enemy ambush team. Request clearance. The JTAC responded immediately. You are cleared hot. Repeat, cleared hot. Morgan squeezed the trigger. The A-10's GU. 8 cannon thundered to the valley, the iconic growl echoing like a beast in a stone cage. Rounds tore into the ambush line, scattering fighters before they realized the attack was coming from the opposite side. Shah followed, releasing precision-guided bombs that wiped out secondary positions hidden under makeshift camouflage nets. The valley lit up with orange ripples of fire. Panicked radio chatter erupted on insurgent comms. They're behind us. The jets split. They split. No, they weren't there before. They appeared. Their confusion was absolute. The mirage had become a weapon. What made this engagement extraordinary wasn't just the success of deception. It was what revealed. The Taliban fighters, so accustomed to reading the land and predicting American movement, suddenly found their observations useless. They could not trust the reflections, the shadows, the positions, or even the timing. The valley that once taught them was now lying to them. Morgan and Shah coordinated another attack run, locking on to targets that had begun to retreat toward the tree line. Smoke drifted upward, mixing with the cooling mountain air as the last traces of sunlight faded. By the end of the sortie, the ambush had collapsed entirely. The Taliban had been defeated not by superior numbers nor heavier firepower, but by a distortion of their expectations. As the aircraft headed back toward Bagram, the radio crackled with the voice of the JTC. Falcon Flight, outstanding work. You destroyed the ambush before it started. No casualties on the ground. Morgan leaned back in her seat, exhausted. Shah's voice came through next. Do you think they know what happened? Morgan shook her head, though no one could see her. No, she said softly. They'll think we were everywhere at once. For the first time in years, Karengal had not predicted American movement. It had been misled, outsmarted, defeated by its own sky. This was the third time U.S. jets successfully deceived Taliban fighters, and it would not be the last. But none of the operations that came after would be as haunting as a mirage run. The day the mountains reflected ghosts. Kunar Province had always been a battlefield of echoes, the crack of rifles bouncing between ridges, the thump of mortars rolling down the valleys, the distant tremble of aircraft slicing through thin mountain air. But on the night of December 2nd, 2012, something unprecedented happened. The mountains went silent. To soldiers on the ground, the sudden quiet felt unnatural, almost threatening. To pilots overhead, it was a warning sign, the kind that meant the enemy was adapting once again. Silence in Afghanistan was never emptiness. It was preparation. U.S. intelligence analysts had intercepted unusual Taliban chatter hours earlier. Short, fragmented messages hinting at a coordinated movement in the remote Nuristan Kunar corridor. Normally, insurgent radio transmissions were chaotic, emotional, filled with overlapping voices. Now they were quiet, clipped, strategically minimal. Someone was organizing them, pulling strings from the shadows. What no one knew yet was that the Taliban were preparing a multi-tiered anti-air ambush, the most sophisticated they had attempted in years. And they believed they had finally predicted the precise moment U.S. aircraft would enter the valley. They were wrong. At forward operating base Joyce, the ops center was lit by cold fluorescent lights and the constant glow of monitors. Signals analysts hunched over audio feeds, while drones transmitted grainy infrared images from the high valley floors. Chief Warrant Officer Miller, a veteran intel specialist, rubbed his temples as he scanned the coded intercepts. "They're too quiet," he muttered. "Way too quiet." The operations officer, Captain Langford, leaned over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" Miller pointed to the logs. "They're not calling in positions. They're not coordinating patrols. They're not asking for reinforcements. They're waiting. That means they think they already know our move." Langford frowned. "But they don't." Miller shook his head. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "They think they do." He tapped one message in particular, a soft, coded phrase repeated several times. "The birds will fly through the notch." Langford whispered, "They're predicting our air corridor." The notch referred to a narrow passage cutting through two cliffs, the single safest route for aircraft entering the valley during night operations. It allowed jets to mass themselves behind the ridges before looping toward the engagement zone. If the Taliban had calculated that correctly, then the notch had turned from protection into a trap. At 1900 hours, the aircrew assembled in the operations tent. Maps of the valley were spread across folding tables, coffee mugs placed between greased pencil marks and threat diagrams. Major Sarah Whitmore, call sign Raven 61, led the briefing. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed concern. "They predicted our entry point. If we take the notch, we're flying into a house of mirrors." Her wingman, Lieutenant Brenner, folded his arms. "So we don't take the notch." Whitmore shook her head. "It's not that simple. The other entrances are too wide. They'll hear us coming from 4 kilometers out. If they hear us, they reposition. We lose surprise." She circled a section on the map, a cluster of jagged peaks to the south. "That's our only chance. A dead zone, a place where sound bounces unpredictably and radar signatures scatter." The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. Ghost formations and mirage runs were dangerous during daylight, but nighttime deception was far riskier. One wrong calculation, and an aircraft could smash into the mountains before the pilots even sensed danger. Whitmore's plan was bold. She would fly a deliberate high-noise decoy route through the notch, making the Taliban believe a two-ship was entering. Meanwhile, a silent pair, Brenner and Captain Ortega, would enter from the dead zone and strike the ambush from behind. Whitmore was, in her own words, the noise that masked the dagger. At 2,120 hours, Raven 61 and 6-2 thundered into the sky. Behind them, the silent attack pair held formation, trailing by several minutes. The night was ink-black, clouds drifting low enough to scrape against mountain ridges. Even with night vision systems, depth perception was treacherous. Whitmore pushed her engines hard as she approached the notch. The sound rippled through the valley like rolling thunder. It was intentional, a message designed for Taliban spotters. On the ground, insurgent fighters stirred. The jets, they are coming. Prepare the launcher. They are entering the notch. The Taliban commander radioed his men. Do not fire early. Wait for them to pass. Hit them as they exit. He wanted to kill, not a display. Meanwhile, Brenner and Ortega descended into the dead zone. A nightmare for pilots. Their instruments struggled to interpret the terrain. Altimeters fluctuated. Targeting pods filled with static as the aircraft slipped into an electromagnetic blind spot. Every second felt like flying through a dark ocean with cliffs rising on both sides. As Whitmore crossed the notch, insurgents triggered their ambush prematurely. They expected her to exit the far side, where they had set up RPG teams and a recoilless rifle nest. She passed over them at full throttle, shaking the valley. Taliban fighters shouted, There! They are coming out." But nothing emerged. Whitmore had pulled into a steep climb immediately after crossing the notch, disappearing into cloud cover. There was no aircraft where the Taliban expected one. The ambush was facing an empty sky. And then, from behind them, Brenner whispered over the comms, "Raven 6-1, we have visual on enemy positions. Multiple heat signatures. They think you're below them." Whitmore replied with a steady voice, "Weapons free, 6-3. End this." Brenner fired first. His F-16 released a pair of GBU-54 laser-guided bombs, which sliced silently through the dark before erupting into blinding fire. The explosions rolled up the ridge like a wave, scattering fighters who had been fully exposed. Ortega followed, strafing a hidden RPG nest with his 20mm cannon. Sparks flew as rounds ripped through rock and metal. Panicked Taliban transmissions crackled through intercept channels. "The jets are behind us." "No, they're above." The notch was a lie. The confusion was total. Fighters scrambled in multiple directions, their ambush unraveling before their commanders could reassert control. Whitmore, still high in the clouds, dove back toward the ridge to deliver the final blow. Her targeting pod locked onto a mortar pit that had gone undetected by drones earlier in the day. "Raven 6-1 rifle," she said calmly, releasing a Maverick missile. It hit like a hammer. Within minutes, the entire ambush collapsed. The mountains, once silent, now echoed with fire. As the aircraft returned to base, the valley once again grew quiet. But this silence felt different. Not one of preparation, but a defeat. In the intelligence room, Miller listened to intercepted Taliban communications. One voice whispered shakily, "They knew our plan." Another, angrier, "The mountains betrayed us." But the last transmission was the most telling. "We cannot trust the notch anymore." For the Taliban, this was a psychological fracture. The notch had been a constant, a predictable gateway. Now it was a void, a place where their expectations collapsed. Whitmore removed her helmet after landing, sweat tracing down her temples despite the bitter cold. Brenner approached her, unstrapping his gear. "You know," he said, "for a moment I thought those dead zone readings would kill us." Whitmore gave a tired smile. "We erased our footprints," she replied, "and left them chasing ghosts.